One, two, three. Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
Great.
Wonderful. Well, welcome. I'm extremely excited to have this conversation with you. Laura Murphy has pioneered the process of civil rights audits. And Laura, before we get started on the conversation and on what, why, and how, what a civil rights audit is, why are companies embracing civil rights audits, and what are some first steps, I'd like you to just tell us briefly about your own journey.
Sure. I am now president of Laura Murphy and Associates. Can you hear me? Is there an echo? Okay. So I'm president of Laura Murphy and Associates, and I help businesses eliminate discriminatory policies, practice, and products in their operations. As you said, I pioneered the first civil rights audit of a tech company with Airbnb in 2016. And I recently wrote a report, The Rationale for and Key Elements of a Business Civil Rights Audit. And I did that report with consultation with over 30 organizations. Prior to that, I spent most of my career as the chief lobbyist for the ACLU Washington Legislative Office, where I ran a team of lobbyists that worked on free speech, privacy, surveillance, LGBTQIA, civil rights, national security, criminal justice reform. And I did that for 17 years, and I was the first woman and first African American to do that. And I made a transition to corporate consulting in 2016.
Wonderful. And now I have an echo. A lot of time, and I want to go straight to the report, the groundbreaking report that you recently published, The Rationale and Key Elements of a Business Civil Rights Audit. And before I go into the report, I want you to tell us who provided input into the report.
First of all, the corporations that I audited, Airbnb and Facebook, provided input, but mainly it was civil rights organizations, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, UNIDOS, the NAACP, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, also activist investor groups, groups like Open Mic and SOC Investments. I also had input from the Ford Foundation because Darren Walker, who's president of the Ford Foundation, has been a big champion of diversity and inclusion in corporate America, especially on boards and in the C-suite. But this is not a diversity and inclusion effort. So I got lots of input from academics and others as well.
Too, because so many of the risks that that the report allows you to flag were informed by key stakeholders such as NGOs, investors, and others. So we'll circle back to that piece. But before we do that, can you just help us understand what is a civil rights audit and how is it different from traditional DEI initiatives or programs?
A civil rights audit is a process that a company voluntarily agrees to where they hire an expert in civil rights who assesses the policies, practices, and products and services of that company to see if they are having a discriminatory impact on communities of color, marginalized communities, and other communities protected by our civil rights laws. That may be people with disabilities, the LGBTQIA community, etc. And after the auditor looks at these policies and practices and products, the auditor comes up with an assessment and makes recommendations to a company, and the company then has to respond. And usually what has happened with Starbucks, Airbnb, and Facebook is that they have come up with specific responses and fixes to problems that have been identified. And then a public report is released. And that is a way for a company to declare that it's being transparent about some of the challenges it's facing.
So the first audit, civil rights audit that you pioneered was Airbnb in 2016. Can you tell us about some things that the company learned about itself through the audit and what the company did to address those risks?
I think that the three young guys who started Airbnb, I'm getting a feedback.
I think we're okay.
Okay. The young guys who started Airbnb really didn't have a grounding in civil rights audits. And I'm sorry, didn't have a grounding in civil rights. And what happened was they felt like they were doing things fairly and with due consideration of all of their users, but they discovered that Black users were getting turned down more often than white users when they were trying to find lodging. And what I think they discovered is that they didn't have enough people in positions to analyze the discrimination complaints. Their customer service needed improvement. Their customer service people didn't know how to treat discrimination complaints. They were treated the same way as if you would call about a lost key. Um, what else did they learn? I think they learned that they didn't have enough people with life experiences who could help early identify these problems. Um, they learned that their discrimination policies weren't strong enough, weren't enforced frequently enough. So they learned a lot. And the company is just completely different now than when it was before I got there and before we embarked upon this audit process together. They have a much more diverse C-suite. They have a tool called Project Lighthouse to assess whether or not there's discrimination on their platform so that they can address it. They have a better trained customer service call line. They've implemented something called the community commitment, which means that you agree to treat people without bias and judgment. And they've lost 1.4 million users of Airbnb because some people refuse to sign the community commitment. But the community commitment is something you have to sign if you want to do anything on the platform. So they've really taken a strong public policy stand, but it hasn't hurt their profitability, according to them. And they just went and had a public offering last December, and I think they're doing very well as a corporation.
And so let's move to the why. And you touched upon it a little bit. With respect to Airbnb, there was, of course, the Airbnb While Black campaign that prompted the company to reflect and to reform. Let's move to other stakeholder pressure. What is driving companies to conduct civil rights audits?
Well, in the last shareholder season, there were resolutions put before the major banks, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo, State Street, and these shareholder resolutions got somewhere between, on average, 30 and 40%. And this really is a wake-up call that a diverse group of Americans and investors want companies to do more than put Black Lives Matter on their mastheads or do more than give $1 million to UNIDOS or the NAACP. They want companies to stop hurting certain communities based on their race or based on their gender or based on their disability or age. They want companies to reform in other ways. And so that's one source of the pressure. Then there's an organization, Color of Change, that has a campaign that's called Beyond the Statement. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd, a lot of companies made grand statements about structural racism. Um, but but what Color of Change is asking many of these companies to do is show us where you're actually making changes. Are you locating toxic waste sites in communities of color? Are you investing in private prisons? Are you using facial recognition technology that cannot tell one brown skinned person apart from another or one Asian person apart from another? So these are the specific kinds of concerns that communities have. And they can't be addressed just by hiring racial minorities and women. They have to be addressed by product managers, by marketing people, by vice presidents who make decisions about whether or not to locate a bank branch in a community of color or not.
About in the
I can't
last,
hear.
oh, can you hear me now?
Can you repeat that? Mm-hmm.
I wanted to focus on one particular stakeholder that we discussed in the last panel, which are shareholders and investors, and you have a section of your report focused on shareholders. Did that surprise you, Laura, the focus that shareholders have with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion in general, the growing focus, but also the embrace of civil rights audits? Where do you see this headed?
It did sort of surprise me. I didn't know anybody was paying attention to my work. And I was gratified. And some of the shareholder investment firms called me in January of this year and said, what is a civil rights audit? What is a racial justice audit? I prefer the term civil rights because it includes a broader groups of people, because oftentimes it's not just about race. Muslim Americans encounter discrimination, people with disabilities encounter discrimination. So I use the term civil rights audit. And it surprised me and it gratified me that shareholder activist groups, investors, were really looking for tangible changes on the part of corporations, and not just hiring, not just in having more diverse boards, but making sure that the products didn't hurt certain communities. I was very gratified by that, and that's why I wrote the report, because there was this growing interest.
I wanted to talk about the civil rights audit as a way to highlight red flags for the board, which is something else that we talked about today. We talked about that in panel 1. In your experience at Airbnb, and I'd love to hear about Facebook as well, the 2020 civil rights audit that you did at Facebook, how did that surface information that management and the board didn't have?
Well, I'll give you an example with Facebook. They didn't know about the degree of harassment that was going on with regard to activist leaders, whether they were leaders of Black Lives Matter or women's rights organizations. A lot of times people would post a picture of something vile and say, this was painted on my car, and this is horrible. But the content moderators were not allowed to take context. And so they would actually take down posts of activists who were decrying, hate speech. And so that's one of the things that I think is really important. Another thing is Facebook didn't seem to realize how much people relied on them to get jobs, housing, and credit. And so when they allowed their advertisers to exclude people based on zip code and other criteria, the activists told Facebook, these are proxies for race. So you're basically, showing a job that only white people can see, or an apartment that only white people can see. And, we got Facebook to settle the litigation that was being filed against them. And so I really think, given the change in the demographics, given that millennials and Gen Zs are the most diverse workforces that the United States will ever encounter, and they want their companies to be more responsive, I I think this is a civil rights audit is a really smart risk mitigation effort. And that's why boards of directors should be engaged and should encourage their CEOs to engage in these audits, because you know you no one has to ace a civil rights course as a condition of becoming a corporate leader. So a lot of people aren't even aware of civil rights laws. They're only aware of them when they get sued. And so why not understand that this kind of discrimination is harmful for the economy? It's harmful for the reputation of the corporation. It's harmful for society at large. And if you say you embrace the values of non-discrimination, you embrace the values of inclusion, you shouldn't be frightened by this kind of audit. You should welcome it as a way of discovering how your products and services land differently on different communities, how your hiring practices may use an algorithm that excludes groups of people unfairly. These are things that corporate leaders ought to know, especially as we have this increasingly diverse pool of investors, workers, and society.
So, Laura, when you led the effort for the civil rights audit at Airbnb and Facebook, very different companies, sort of culturally, what are some surprises? What surprised you, both positive and negative, and both in the outcome and the corporate reforms and the willingness and appetite for reform?
What surprised me is when I got in there and talked to corporate leaders, they finally began to see this as something that could benefit them long term. And it surprised me um, that they turned around as quickly as they did and helped facilitate the audit. At first, you've got people who are in public affairs in these corporations who say, okay, we're going to do this to quiet, these noisy interest groups that are attacking us. And it's never going to work if that's the reason you're going to do it. You've got to do it because you want to know how your company is operating and affecting these different communities. And you want to make sure that the effect is not harmful. So when I got to the leaders of these corporations, they had to kind of override sometimes the people who I was dealing with at first, who just saw this as some sort of PR stunt. And maybe if we did this, these noisy groups would go away. And so I just think a smart CEO, a smart COO is going to understand that this is risk mitigation, and this is a net win for the corporation to be able to publicly state what they're doing to reduce discrimination and build inclusion.
Of risk mitigation and risk in general, we have an audience of quite a few lawyers. And did you have any interaction with the legal teams or the general counsel? And what was the appetite for the civil rights audit from those teams?
I remember when I interacted at first with the legal team at Airbnb, they were like, "Oh no, we can't have a public report, and this this is not going to be helpful." And it took a lot of cajoling. Um, and I said, "Look, if we do this right, and you're sued for discrimination, you will be able to show a judge that you are taking proactive steps to reduce discrimination on the platform." And it took a while. And, I had to use all kinds of charm and cajoling to get the general counsel there. But when he was there, he was all the way there. And in fact, the state of California had opened an investigation about housing discrimination with Airbnb. And they entered into an agreement. And this report that I produced for Airbnb and the update that I produced in 2019 really made the state of California understand what actions Airbnb was taking independent of that regulatory agency. And that put them on a much stronger footing to have conversations. Now, I am not going to say that a civil rights audit reduces every single instance of discrimination in every company. Obviously, that is not true. But it is a very solid start if it is taken seriously by the company to look at areas where there may be problems and come up with the auditor with solutions. And maybe you settle a few lawsuits that you were prepared to go to the mat on. I just think this is a real asset for the general counsel. If they can come to see that, you know, this will put the company in better standing if they ever do get to the courtroom.
I wanted to emphasize one aspect of the report. You said public. Now, as you're conducting the audit, you're gathering all sorts of information. What information ultimately is disclosed to the public, and how is that information curated? Because part of the value of the audit is, of course, as a mirror for the company to see its own red flags. And part of it is a communication tool, as you alluded to, for the public and regulators and potential litigants. But how is what information makes it in, how is that mediated?
That's a mediation for sure. Um, I I submit, first of all, as an auditor, I signed all kinds of non disclosure agreements. Certainly, a corporation doesn't want anyone in there who's going to release trade secrets, who's going to leak, so this has to be a very clearly confidential relationship with the understanding that a public report will be written at the end. And so it was a negotiation. It was like, well, look, I'm going to have to talk about this in the report because the groups have talked about this issue publicly. You need to come up with an answer. Or I'm going to be forced to say that the company has refused to address this issue. And I don't want to say that. I want to help you get to a resolution. So, how do we get to a resolution? How do we make sure that the section of the report dealing with contracting, for example, or investment in private prisons, something that has been the subject of wars or boycotts or social media campaigns against the company. How are we going to address this? And that part is really where the rubber meets the road. It is a real negotiation. And, I press companies very hard to answer the questions that people have already put forth publicly, because it's going to look like you're not serious if you don't answer these questions. But I show my draft to the leaders before it's public, of course, and there's a back and forth. And so ultimately, I think we get to areas of agreement. Sometimes we have areas where we'll agree to disagree that I feel like I have to write about, that may not have been properly addressed. So it's a collaborative process, but it's a lot less antagonistic than a lawsuit. So I think it's a better way to go. I mean, lawsuits
Fascinating.
are necessary.
Oh,
Lawsuits are necessary sometimes,
your
but
sound went out.
I said lawsuits are necessary sometimes, but I think you can also avoid litigation if you do this properly. Can you hear me?
You said
Okay,
lawsuits
sorry.
are necessary sometimes. Sometimes.
Sometimes.
So I wanted to get into the weeds just a little bit in our last 4 minutes or so. The report comes up with 10 recommendations for a civil rights audit, 10 key recommendations. What are 3 or 4 of the most salient?
I'd say that the CEO and the leadership team have to buy into the audit process, because without them, you don't get the cooperation of the various units and divisions within a company. I would say that the audit has to be led by a person or a firm that's independent. You can't do these audits in house. Um, I would say that the audit has to be public, and the final report has to be public, and it has to include a clear plan of action. I would say those are the, and one, maybe I would also add that stakeholders should be involved. You need to talk to the people who are giving you the most criticism.
Um, okay, so I wanted to end, so we have 3 minutes left, and as you know, you get two parting gifts, a magic wand and a crystal ball. And look, there are obviously a lot of hurdles with respect to companies embracing civil rights audits or civil rights, their responsibility in advancing civil rights in general. If you could wave a magic wand and make some things disappear, anything, what would those things be? And you could have up to 3.
Well, can I add something instead of making something disappear? Could I just make uh, understanding our laws and why discrimination is antithetical to our values? Can I make us maybe a basic civil rights course a key component of a business education? Um, I just think that the ignorance about why groups are upset, you know, could be really reduced if people understood that we're not supposed to, you know, pay women at a lower rate than men. We're not supposed to exclude, racial minorities from the workforce. I just think people need to understand how we got to this point, and that we do have structural discrimination and racism in our society, and we need to address it structurally. So I would like to see the education of CEOs improve and change. I mean, people can start on their own with reading lists. There are a lot of great reading lists out there. I just think it should be part of the core curriculum to understand a diverse society and what laws govern how we interact with each other. And those laws also govern corporations. Corporations are supposed to abide by civil rights laws. So I would say that that is the main thing. And the second thing is that we need to talk to people who disagree with us more often. We have become a society that fears the other. And I make it a point to talk to um, people who think civil rights laws go too far, people within corporations who believe that. I make it a point to talk to people who look different than me, who are from different backgrounds. This era where we can have this bro culture and think we're going to survive as businesses, I just think that era is over. And if you're looking down the road at a more diverse workforce, a more diverse population, more women, more people with disabilities, more people who are out, you need to talk to these people before you get into trouble, and not wait until trouble happens.
So speaking of looking down the road, what do you see in your crystal ball?
Well, State Street, uh, I think the fifth largest asset manager in the US, State Street Global Advisors announced day before yesterday that it was doing a civil rights audit. Citibank announced last week that it was doing a very limited audit. So I know that there will be more shareholder resolutions. So in my crystal ball, I see this conversation going, and either you kind of get